Hi, thank you all for coming out. My name is Eric Oliver. I'm a political scientist. I study public opinion. I've studied a lot of things about American politics. Right now I'm really studying about public opinion. And one thing I'm particularly interested in are how people understand the world around them and how people come to the beliefs that they do. And I want to start with this image. We are all very familiar with this image of September 11th, 2001. What we may not be familiar with, or we may not necessarily have this sort of same agreement about, is what actually happened that day. According to the popular narrative that was released in the 9/11 Commission report, and I think that most people agree with, was that two planes flew into the World Trade Center that were commandeered by hijackers. They exploded within the World Trade Center, and then the explosions itself caused the World Trade Center to fall down, as well as hijackings in two other planes. Now, that was a common explanation, but soon after the events of 9/11, an alternative explanation began circulating in the population. And this was one that was very different from the government explanation. This was the idea that the government itself secretly orchestrated the attacks of 2011, that the government had planted explosives in the World Trade Center, and that the explosions and the demolition of the World Trade Center building was something that was intentionally orchestrated. Now, I was curious as a political scientist about this. Wow, both sort of the power of this narrative and how popular it might have been. So I asked it in a survey, and I asked a question like this. A small number of government officials secretly planned the attacks of September 11, 2001 because they wanted America to go to war in the Middle East. And when I got the response back, I was shocked because 20% of Americans said they agreed with this statement. But I asked about other types of questions, and it ensures that this was not anomalous. For example, in repeated surveys, we find that roughly around 24% of the American population believe that President Obama is not a citizen. We see that 12% of the population thinks that vapor trails that come from jets flying high in the sky are a program of secret government spraying. You know, I'm not sure what the chemical is, but it's some sort of chemical spraying the population with. 40% of the population thinks that the Food and Drug Administration is deliberately withholding natural cures for cancer because of pharmaceutical company pressure. Now, these beliefs may seem very strong, but I think we need to put them in some kind of context. Americans hold a lot of different kinds of beliefs. For example, a lot of Americans believe in paranormal and supernatural phenomena. 70% of us believe in angels. 55% of us believe in Satan. 73% of us believe in extrasensory perception, and 42% of us believe in ghosts. These are just some of the samples. Americans, conversely, don't cotton to science very strongly. When we ask people about their scientific beliefs, more than 50% say they don't believe in Darwinian evolution. 20% say that vaccines cause autism. 30% that think that eliminating gluten from their diet will actually make them healthier. And 40% think that dinosaurs and humans coexisted. Now, there's something very interesting about all of these different beliefs. First off, these beliefs are highly related to each other. What we find in our data, as we go through and we look at what we call correlations, we find that basically the likelihood that you believe that eliminating gluten from your diet will make you healthier is strongly related to whether or not you believe in ghosts, which in turn is strongly related to whether or not you believe Obama faked his birth certificate. In other words, all of these beliefs seem to array themselves in a very interesting constellation amongst many Americans. Secondly, all of these beliefs have something in common, and what they have in common is what we call magical. We call them sort of magical beliefs. Now, some of these beliefs are things that you might have, and a lot of times when I tell people that I'm doing research on magical beliefs and I explain magical beliefs to them, they say, oh, my belief isn't magical, that's my belief, it's truth. So let me explain a little bit about what we mean by magical beliefs. Magical beliefs have two characteristics to them. They assign causes to phenomena that cannot be directly observed. They try to explain the world in terms of events or forces that we cannot see directly. Now, of course, not all things that, subscribe to this first definition are magical. There's a lot in science, for example, that implicates things that we can't observe, things like dark matter or dark energy, which we can't observe right now. The second part is really what's important for magical beliefs, that people hold these beliefs in contrast to other explanations for the same phenomenon that can be caused, that are based on observable phenomenon. So this is what's really important about a magical belief. If you live in a society and you believe there's some sort of invisible, alien presence that's causing the plants to grow, and this is all you know, it's not necessarily magical. It's just that's what your science is. When it becomes magical is when it transgresses some sort of belief that's based on observation. And I think this is what's really important about magical beliefs, is that magical beliefs, in some sense, are transgressive to science. Now, what's really remarkable about magical beliefs is that we're not supposed to be having them. This guy, Max Weber, he was one of the founders of sociology. Writing in the late 19th century, he said the world was becoming disenchanted. We were losing the magic that infused and animated kind of the medieval mind. Science, the Enlightenment, industrialization, this was changing the world. We were going to become rational. We were going to become secular. And in fact, that's not really happening. Now, a lot of us seem to think of, we seem to think of the world in this sort of post-Enlightenment perspective, whereby we have abstract ideas, and from these abstract ideas we deduce our preferences, and from these preferences we maybe formulate clearly thought out opinions that are subject to change and debate and logical deliberation. But in fact, a lot of Americans don't see the world that way. They don't view the world from a post-Enlightenment perspective. They view the world like this, or like this, or like this. And what I'd like to do today is I want to talk a little bit about these magical beliefs. They're very common in the American public, and I think they're very important for our current political climate. And I want to talk about two things. First, why people hold magical beliefs. All of us hold probably some magical beliefs, are susceptible to some magical thinking. And secondly, I want to talk a little bit about what this means for American politics. So we'll talk about the first thing first. Okay, magical beliefs have two key components. And the first component about magical beliefs that's important to recognize is that they serve emotional functions. And this insight doesn't come from me, it comes from this guy, Bronislaw Malinowski, who was one of the founders of anthropology. And early in the 20th century, he went to the Tribune Islands near New Guinea. And the Tribune Islanders were a primitive people. They seemed to have lots of superstitions and magical beliefs. And, the kind of European colonialists at the time tended to sort of denigrate these people and say, oh, it's just because they're less intelligent and not very capable, and it was a sign of their intellectual limitations. And Malinowski, spending time with the Tribune Islanders, realized otherwise. The Tribune Islanders had discovered all sorts of ingenious cues and methods for understanding and living in their world. But where the Tribune Islanders had magical beliefs is where they faced uncertainty. So, for example, when the Tribune Islanders fished in shallow lagoons and ponds, they didn't have a lot of superstitions or magical beliefs. But when they went out into the deep sea fishing where it was very dangerous, suddenly they were rife. Like contemporary deep sea fishermen today, they had lots and lots of superstitions and magical beliefs. And what Malinowski came to understand is that our beliefs, and particularly our magical beliefs, primarily serve emotional functions. And let me explain how this works a little bit. Most of the time, from a biological perspective, we sit in an emotionally neutral place. This is what's most efficient for us. It's to set some sort of emotional homeostatic set point. Now, in our environment, we occasionally see things that are threatening or dangerous to us, for example, like a poisonous snake. When this happens, numerous hormones start pumping through us, our heart rates rise, we become very, very alert, and we basically move into a state we call fear. Now, the fear is a motivating state. It's getting us to try to do something. It's nature's way of protecting us. And what we try to do is eliminate the thing that's threatening us and making us afraid. Typically, maybe say running away. And that's basically how most animals work in the environment. This is the function of animal emotions. Now, humans, though, are unique among animals because we have the capacity for imagination. And what the capacity for imagination gives us is something else that most animals don't have. Uncertainty. And think about it, we are the only species that's able to imagine our own mortality, able to imagine our own demise, able to imagine sort of bad things happening to us. And if you look around the world and you think about things where uncertainty is causing, whether it's battles, whether it's deep sea fishing, whether it's the Cubs, or whether it's death, which is kind of like rooting for the Cubs, we see something similar. It generates negative feelings for us. But here's the question, how do we deal with these negative feelings? We can't simply run away from something that we don't know, or we can't recognize, and we can't see. So instead, we have to find something else to bring us back to our emotional set point. And this is where a magical belief comes in. Because the magical belief basically serves as an emotional palliative. It's something that's there to make us feel better. And once we get it, we can return to our set point here. So when we think about this, the important thing to understand about magical thinking and magical beliefs is they occur when our uncertainty is great and when the stakes are high. And we can sort of say there are two categories of magical beliefs in this regard. There are superstitions, which are sort of based for very particular circumstances. I will wear my lucky hat to a Cubs game, for example, but I'm not necessarily likely to wear that to church. Those are sort of more of our superstitions. And then there are greater magical beliefs, what we might call magical belief systems, and these tackle the big questions: mortality, disease, love. And we rely on these in much more institutionalized ways, and I'll come back to that in a second. The second thing about magical thinking, which I think is important to recognize, is that magical thinking follows certain patterns. In a sense, it has a grammar to it. And this insight came also from an early anthropologist named James Frazer, who did a compendium of religious and superstitious beliefs from cultures all over the world in the late 19th century. And he wrote this famous book called The Golden Bough. And Frazer recognized that across all of these different cultures, magical beliefs had two common characteristics. One of this was what he called homeopathic magic, which is that people who hold magical beliefs tend to think that things that resemble each other share certain common characteristics. A classic example of this is like a voodoo doll. We think that by making an effigy of somebody who we want to harm or to help, we can somehow or another influence them in that particular way. The second kind of magic that Frazer noticed was what he called contagious magic. And this is the idea that if we have contact with something that's really good or contact with something that's really evil or bad or taboo, that we will become infused with that or infected with that. And so that the essences of sacred things can be transferred to us. Now, the interesting thing about James Frazer is that James Frazer presaged, I think, in this typology, something that has revolutionized the social sciences over the past 20 years in the work of this guy. Some of you may be familiar with Danny Kahneman. And this is the whole field of behavioral economics. And what Danny Kahneman and his colleague Amos Tversky did was recognize that our whole way of making judgments under uncertainty relies on certain types of things he calls heuristics. And heuristics are cognitive shortcuts for making sense and judgments of the world. Our brains are constantly using these kinds of heuristics to process just basic kinds of information. So, for example, this is a Hansa triangle, some of you may be familiar with. And the interesting thing about the Hansa triangle is that we see a triangle on the screen, but in fact, the triangle doesn't exist. This is our brain actually formulating something, filling in the gaps, as it were, from some suggested pieces of information. And we do this in unconscious ways, and we do this around with all kinds of information that we process about the world. Now, Danny Kahneman, like James Frazer, recognized that one of these heuristics that we're very common with is what he calls a representativeness heuristic, which we tend to think of things that are like things, that look like things or resemble things that we know the qualities of, would share those qualities. And so we were interested in testing this out to see how this related to magical beliefs. And one of the things we did was we did an experiment in one of our national surveys. And we asked people, suppose you were locked in a room and the key was under one of these 5 objects. Now, the thing to know is that the sick person who locked you in the room also made one of the objects really, really dangerous. And that is the object that needs to be avoided. So, which of these objects do you think is the most dangerous? C? Yeah. Which object, by the way, do you think would be least dangerous? D, E. What we find in our survey, like 56% of Americans think that the spinally object, my kids, by the way, just love this. They think, of course, this is the dangerous object. They know it. They think that's the most dangerous object. And as we might suspect, 67% think that the little weird shape there is the least dangerous. So if you actually want to trick somebody and harm them, this is the shape to use. Not that you should. The idea here, though, is that here, once again, we're seeing a heuristic in action. Based on a limited amount of information, we're making inferences based on things that they resemble. Here, object C, because it resembles a spider, we think of course, is more dangerous than these other kind of abstract shapes. Now, magical beliefs embody these intuitive heuristics. And I'll give you another example of how we've been trying to elicit this in our survey work. We tell people who are taking the survey, suppose you're playing the lottery for a large prize. And a friend says that he won a $5,000 lottery prize by rubbing his ticket on. Now, half the sample we randomly assign to one group, which is called a paper. We tell them it's a paper napkin that the friend rubbed the lottery ticket on. Would you give it a try? The other half of the sample, we tell them the same thing, but it's a $1 bill, and ask them if they would give that a try. Now, when people are asked would they try the paper napkin, 40% said, yeah, sure, try the paper napkin. Okay. But if you tell them it's a $1 bill, that goes up to 57%. In other words, the reason why our magical beliefs have the power that they do is because they resonate with these kinds of innate heuristics that we carry around. And so what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit more. What we're really interested in doing is trying to get at, okay, who is susceptible to magical thinking? How does magical thinking occur across the population? We want to do something more than just actually look at real beliefs. We want to try to get at the psychology behind these beliefs. And we think we're decoding the grammar behind these beliefs by looking at these heuristics. And so what we've been doing in our research is looking at the two pillars of magical thinking, emotional disequilibria and the susceptibility to certain kinds of heuristics. Because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to focus on the second part here. And I'm going to ask you I'll give you an example of how we're going about basically doing this. So when we ask people to take our surveys, we usually start off with a following series of questions. And we ask them, like, imagine you're going to answer these questions really quickly. Just say the first thing that comes to your head. You're going to have a series of paired choices and choose between each of these paired choices and try to do it as quickly as possible. So I'll go through them with you. Would you rather stab a photograph of your family or stick your hands in a bowl of slimy worms, or sometimes we say cockroaches? Would you rather yell, "I hope I die tomorrow" out loud 5 times, or ride in a speeding car without a seatbelt? Would you rather sleep in laundered pajamas once worn by Charles Manson, or put a nickel in your mouth that you found on the ground? Would you rather grind your shoes into an unmarked grave or stand in line for 3 hours at the DMV? And would you rather spend the night in a luxurious house where our family was recently murdered, or spend the night in a dingy bus station? Now, as you might have guessed, what we've done with these questions is we're pairing 2 different types of things. We're pairing something that is tangibly or demonstrably costly for us. Picking the nickel off the ground, putting it in your mouth, standing in line at the DMV, versus something that is metaphorically or symbolically costly. Stabbing a photograph of my family. In reality, all I'm doing is stabbing a piece of paper, but it's my family. Of course, it's going to make me feel bad. And so what we're interested in is trying to gauge people's susceptibility to this. And I'll tell you how this works. We've done this now in several nationally representative survey samples. And when we ask people, for example, the percentage of Americans who would do this, really 2/3 say they would rather stick their hand in a bowl of slimy worms than stab a photograph of their family. If, however, we switch it to cockroaches, it goes to about half and half. So you can see what your family's worth to you in some ways. We see that more people would rather ride without a seatbelt than yell, "I hope I die tomorrow." We see that more people would rather put a nickel in their mouth that they found on the ground than sleep in Charles Manson's pajamas. More people, this to me was the big surprising one, because there are a few things worse for me than standing in line at the DMV. And they would stand in line at the DMV and secretly grind their shoes in an unmarked grave. And they split about half and half with the grimy bus station versus the luxurious house with the recent murder. We have another question I won't go into that we put into this, but we can add these things together and put together a scale. And what we see here is, like, for example, if we take people who consistently choose the metaphorically to avoid the metaphorical cost. If they're always, absorbing the tangible cost, they get a 1. And we can put this together in a simple additive scale. And what we see here are 2 things. We see that the American population, for example, about a quarter of them are what we would call tangible thinkers. And these are people who would pretty regularly accept a symbolic cost or a metaphorical cost, but they really want to avoid the tangible cost, the picking the nickel up and putting it in their mouth, or riding in a speeding car without a seatbelt. About 50% of the population is somewhere in the middle. They're sort of mixed. They divide on these particular questions. And about 25% are at the top end of the scale. And these are what we call symbolic thinkers. And these are people who always will take a tangible cost and always will seek to avoid a symbolic cost. Now, the interesting thing about this scale for us is that when we then go and look at some actual magical beliefs, we find the following. It actually correlates. This is a very, very strong correlation. What we see here, these are the percent of people who we ask them if they believe in things like heaven, angels, or Satan. And the percentages basically double as we move along our symbolic thinking scale. We ask people not just about some sort of, this also holds, I should say, for a number of other beliefs, like say, for example, paranormal beliefs, if you believe in the power of crystals, if you believe in ESP, if you believe in ghosts. It also works for conspiracy theories. People who believe in conspiracy theories tend to score much, much more higher in their symbolic thinking. It also has to do with people's experiences. We ask people in surveys, for example, once again, about some supernatural experiences. Have you ever felt the presence of God? Have you ever received a sign from God? Have you ever changed something by praying? And people who are at the high end of our symbolic thinking scale are much more likely to report those types of behaviors. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this scale is that it correlates negatively with belief in evolution and a number of other scientific beliefs. So in other words, the higher you are in the symbolic thinking scale, also the less likely you are to believe in Darwinian evolution. Which leads me then to the sort of the other half I want to talk about today, which is about politics. Because if there's one divide right now in politics, it's around issues like this, and these religious issues. I don't know how many of you saw the Republican debate last night, but at least 4 of the candidates who are on stage describe themselves and describe their views in overtly Christian, fundamentalist Christian terms. And to me, what's interesting is that when we look at these types of views, the worldview that's ensconced by a lot of these fundamentalist views is very different from the kind of post-Enlightenment Immanuel Kant type worldview I was discussing earlier. It's a worldview that's, I think, kind of strangely but appropriately captured in this picture. It's a worldview that understands our times in terms of a sort of biblical prophecy, of an ultimate struggle between good and evil, of an unfolding of a great apocalyptic future that's imminent and upon us, and something that can be discerned by looking at biblical texts. And when we ask people, for example, the American population, what they think about these views, these are views that are common to fundamentalist religions in Christianity, but also common to fundamentalist religions across the world, in terms of with relative texts, I should say. And what we find that when we ask questions, for example, do you think that we're living in end times as foretold in biblical prophecy? Or that many problems can be solved by prayer? Or that politics is ultimately a struggle between good and evil? Or that the Bible is the inerrant word of God? Or that there are hidden codes in the Bible that can be deciphered if you have the right knowledge? Large percentages of Americans hold these types of beliefs. To me, what's remarkable is like 32% of Americans think that we're living in end times as foretold by biblical prophecy. And I'm imagining that if you really do hold this belief to be true, then the world must be rife with symbols for you. It must be ripe for metaphor. You're probably continually looking for signs of the coming apocalypse. We can put these together into a scale that we call sort of a fundamentalism scale. And what we see here when we think about American politics is something that's pretty interesting. So once again, if we look at these particular items going back to our symbolic thinking scale, we see that symbolic thinkers are much more likely to agree with these types of items, and tangible thinkers are more likely to disagree with all of these items that constitute a fundamentalism scale. But we can also sort of see how they play out in terms of contemporary politics. So when we look at the population as a whole, we find about 24% of Americans are what we would call themselves liberal. And if you look at their party affiliations, and here I denoted party affiliations: blue, Democrat; yellow, Independent; red, Republican. We see something that's kind of interesting. Amongst the 24% who are liberal, most of them score very low on the fundamentalism scale. Most of those are Democrats. There's a small number of liberal Republicans. There are 2% of people who describe themselves as liberal who I would score high on the fundamentalism scale, sort of a threshold point where we'd say they're a fundamentalist. But they're all Democrats. They're not really, there's not enough. There are either Republicans or independents. When we look at moderates, this is the largest single group in the United States in terms of ideology. We see also a somewhat similar pattern. Amongst moderates who are not fundamentalists, they sort of split between Democrats and independents, and a smaller number identify themselves as Republicans. And once again, a similar pattern when we look at those who identify themselves as fundamentalist. What's interesting is when we bring conservatives in, and I think this actually speaks a lot to the debate last night. When you see people who identify themselves as conservative, amongst non-fundamentalists here, there's once again a majority would identify themselves as Republican. But 15% of the population identifies both strongly as a fundamentalist and as Republican and as conservative, compared to only 4% who identify as Democrat and 4% who don't have a party affiliation. And I think this split right here is the source of a lot of the current tension and conflict within the Republican Party. It's not necessarily over fiscal policy. It's over a more metaphorical set of policies. And let me show you what I mean by this. So we asked people in our surveys, for example, do you think that the head is a better guide than the heart, or the heart is a better guide than the head? And when we asked this, for example, if you compare just liberals, moderates, and conservatives, if you look at the middle, there's not a big difference between them by ideology. But boy, if you ask this by whether or not, whether they score on a fundamentalism scale, you see very, very big differences. Basically, fundamentalists, and we see this in many other types of questions. We ask them if they use their gut to make important decisions. Do they rely on science? Do they make sort of things deliberately, or do they make things intuitively? And people like our magical thinkers, fundamentalists themselves, really say that they understand the world in intuitive ways, in gut ways. And we can see this then in how they interpret policy. And let me give you an example here. We asked a question in our survey, for example, now that the economy is doing better, is it time to raise the taxes on the top income brackets to pay down the deficit? And this is the percent of people who say that they're against raising taxes on the rich, who say, no, we shouldn't do that. And as we would expect, liberals are very low on this. They like the idea of raising taxes on the rich. Moderates are not too bothered by it either. Conservatives are more bothered by it. And there are no real differences here by people's religious views. But we ask a separate question that's also related to this, and we say, how much do you agree with the statement, every time we raise taxes by 10%, we lose 10% of our liberty? As we would think, conservatives are more likely to agree with it, but the really big differences are by religion. And what this suggests to us is that for people who embrace a fundamentalist religion, people who are using a magical belief system to understand the world is rife with metaphor, and they're very, very susceptible to these types of metaphorical languages. And we can see this in other types of policies, too. What's interesting when we think about issues like social issues like gay marriage or abortion, these are issues that, yes, there are differences across the ideological spectrum, but the differences in the ideological spectrum pale in comparison to differences across religious beliefs. Now, obviously, there are a lot of churches that emphasize these types of issues, and so people are drawing on their church beliefs to sort of inform their political preferences on these types of issues. But nevertheless, it's interesting that this type of pattern is really existing kind of outside of ideology. Similarly, we ask questions like, for example, do people want to ban genetically modified foods? Or do people want to subsidize homeschooling? And we see a similar kind of pattern here, where there are a lot of issues, for example, that are on the American political agenda that don't line up necessarily with simple ideologies. Mandating vaccines, banning genetically modified food, oftentimes with foods and health. And what we see here is that magical beliefs actually are a much bigger predictor of people's attitudes on these types of issues than what we would think about is ideology. And what we're taking away from this and what we're really trying to understand here is we think that there's another sort of force that's actually organizing how Americans understand politics. It's not simply a matter of sort of ideology where people are drawing on sort of conservative principles or liberal principles to inform their political beliefs. We think about sort of resistance or hostility to vaccines. These are not informed by logical, reasoned deductions from available evidence. They're informed by affect. They're informed by intuition. They're informed by people's feelings. And this is what up until now, we really have not given credence as that as a way for people to understand the political world. And so what we're trying to do with this project is really decode what is the language of magical thinking and how is it shaping the way that we're handling most public policy. Thank you. Sorry if that went on.
No, it's fantastic. I mean, one of the things that just really struck me, if we cannot reason, if we can't have discussions based on some degree of logic, then how do we How do we cross the divide? How do we bring the two camps together?
Well, I think this is one of the reasons why we have such a hard time with political discourse in this country.
Right.
It's not that it's liberals and Democrats that can't talk to each other, or liberals and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, or Democrats and Republicans that can't talk to each other. It's people within these parties. I mean, we all probably know somebody who has a strong belief that we find just preposterous. And when we find ourselves like somebody who believes in some wacky conspiracy theory, or somebody who has some particular belief, and when we try to talk to them about this belief, you can find it's often like talking into a brick wall. I have an old family friend, and this was one of the inspirations for this project, and we were talking once, and she had all of these inconsistencies in her beliefs. And I was trying to talk through and sort of say, but how could you be in favor of these provisions, for example, of the Affordable Care Act, but hate Obamacare? And how could you be so, obsessed with organic food and resisting vaccines and thinking that, but, also then rejecting science? And she just smiled at me and she said, the difference between you and I is that you believe in reason and I believe in the Bible. And that was very prescient. And what she's communicating to me is not that she's not a logical person, she does very well in the world, it's that science doesn't hold a lot of meaning for her, it doesn't have a lot of utility for her, and her religious beliefs actually do hold a lot of utility for her, and that's the way she's understanding the world. And I think the difficulty is when we have some sets of beliefs that are circulating in the population that are impervious to any kind of dialogue or exchange, that because people are holding on to them for emotional reasons. They're part of their emotional support.
So you mentioned coded language, and we know that politicians engage in that quite a bit. So I'm wondering if you can give us examples of, even from last night or from over the years. I remember George W. Bush was very adept at using language to speak to Christians. And he would talk about, he would even pull from some songs, that was very clear that he was speaking to this specific group of the base. So what are some of the examples?
Sure. So for those of you who didn't see the Republican debate last night, it was supposed to be about your money, your politics. And it was on CNBC, and it was supposed to be about taxes and fiscal policy and all this dry stuff. And most of the candidates would have nothing to do with that. And what they were doing was just talking in symbols. And so at one point, for example, Christie gets up and says, I care about defending the population from these threats. And, be afraid, there are threats out there, and I'm going to secure them. And or you have a Ted Cruz who's like, the problem is the government. It's the government and all the spending and the government wanting to take away things from you, and you need to be certain. So within this, of course, are these metaphors. Most of us rely on the government in deep, deep ways, whether it's for Medicare, anticipation of Social Security, or just, roads, police. Nevertheless, the idea that the government becomes some kind of nefarious entity out there that has an intentionality in and of its own is what's being referenced and then leveraged into, I think what they're trying to do is speak to, I am like you, I am trying to tap your emotional buttons. I am trying to trigger an emotional resonance for people. And this is what their job as candidates are.
Do the Republicans or the Democrats which does a better job at actually? Because it comes down to manipulation.
Yes, I think you don't last long in politics if you're not good at this.
Right.
And so they do equally job. But they have different constituencies. And
right.
So, like for example, the Republican debate, they're speaking to the constituency that I have up there, and it's a constituency that's deeply divided, I think, in terms of its magical beliefs and its policy preferences. And so it's a fine line, and I think we sort of see this in the reason that a Donald Trump or a Ben Carson is leading so far ahead of the Republican establishment candidates is this big fracturing along this. And if you listen to Ben Carson and Donald Trump, they're not offering any kind of specifics.
Absolutely.
They're just trafficking in metaphor and symbol. And you could say on the right, and Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders do the same thing there, but they do it to the symbols that resonate with their constituencies.
Right. Is there a way to, and maybe this is the same question, but the internet seems to play a big role in this as well, right? Because now, probably more than ever, you can find your echo chamber. You can find people who espouse your beliefs. And I'm wondering, how has the internet helped or hurt this notion of magical thinking?
So I first got interested in conspiracy theories when I was a graduate student, and I was at Berkeley. And I had long hair at the time.
A place where, I mean,
these
they abound,
things
conspiracy theories.
And it was funny, when you have long hair, you get both treated differently by authority figures, and then like the freaks on the street were like, hey, you're part of us. And this one guy, he said, here, man, you got to read this. And I was like, okay. And it was like this handwritten page that he had photocopied of his conspiracy theory. And at first I was dismissive, but I was like, wait a minute, this is actually how this person's understanding the world, and he's going to a lot of trouble to do this. And at the time, he was limited to sort of handing it out to sort of seemingly fellow travelers on the street. Now he, of course, has a blog or a website and probably has a huge following.
Yeah.
Big
Twitter following.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and so it's, you know, with the explosion of media, the availability for the availability of these transgressive types of narratives to come out can be spread so easily. I think the other thing that's happened too, the reason why we probably see so many of these types of beliefs is out there is, I think we have a crisis of authority in this country, and it stems...
What do you mean by that, a crisis of authority?
Well, I would say 50 years ago, we trusted the government, we trusted our doctor, we trusted scientists. You know, we thought, okay, what they say to us is good. Now...
But that wasn't...
Right.
Yeah.
I think it was a good idea. You know, I think as part of the 60s and the 70s, we realized, well, maybe these people aren't so trustworthy.
Right.
But the problem is that, and that's great, we have democratized, you know, expertise in a way. And that's what science is all about. You know, science is about skepticism.
Right.
Science is not about... It's not about like
yeah.
making truth claims. It's about it's about skeptical inquiry. But that generates a lot of uncertainty. If I don't know that the government can be trustworthy, it really, I would feel very apprehensive. If scientists don't really know what they're talking about, then why should I believe what they're saying? And on the other hand, I might encounter a narrative that has much more intuitive resonance for me. Of course, you know, vaccines cause autism. Look, I'm sticking this toxin into my body. You know, that
doesn't make sense.
It's so counterintuitive.
Right.
That has a visceral reality for me.
Sure.
The idea of, you know, some sort of conditional probability of getting some abstract disease does not have that same kind of resonance.
I know you started by saying that Americans are, I mean, we engage in a lot of magical thinking, but are we is there another country or another place that's as, you know, as kind of the good, we look at the world in very binary terms, right?
Yes.
Good.
Well, I mean, the one thing I want to emphasize here is I'm not trying to demonize magical beliefs, and we're all susceptible to magical thinking because it is based on these innate heuristics and these intuitive heuristics that this is how we process information about the world.
And you were saying that as we tend to get older, we tend to believe a little bit more in heaven.
Yeah. I mean, it becomes very convenient. Heaven becomes a convenient belief as you get older in life. And so if you think about it, or, you know, if you live under conditions of stress, if you're in a marginalized population where you don't know how you're going to pay your rent or where the next meal is going to come from, that's a lot of uncertainty to carry around, and it's a lot of emotional stress. And magical beliefs, if they help ameliorate that, can be very functional. So it's not surprising that they're very, very common across the world's population. And you could see instances of them around the world. I'm working on a book about this, and I was sort of collecting some of these, and I found some fascinating ones. Like, evidently in Korea, it's common to believe that, you know, it's very, very bad luck to sign your name in red ink. You know, it evokes blood. And Syrians in the 1930s, you know, banned yo-yos because they thought yo-yos would cause drought. I don't know how that started, but...
And there was some numbers.
And in certain cultures, certain numbers are considered inauspicious, or you know, we live in a high-rise building here in Chicago,
13,
and there's no 13th floor.
Sure.
You know, we are by no means immune to these types of things.
So is magical thinking, is it innate? Or is it something that's more learned? Is it a combination? I mean, is it kind of woven into our DNA or hardwired into our brains?
What I would say is I think the heuristics that inform and animate magical thinking are innate to us. The magical beliefs themselves, few people actually make up their own magical beliefs. We tend to adopt them, you know, as we circulate. A great example of this is, you know, prior to 2008, nobody thought that Barack Obama was not a citizen.
Yeah.
It was only during the campaign that that rumor got spread, and then it got picked up by certain groups. But nobody was sort of coming to this independently. They were hearing this, and for people who wanted to believe that, were like, yeah, that kind of makes sense, and that's a good belief for me. And so I think we're all susceptible to this way of thinking. The likelihood that we embrace particular beliefs really depends on our circumstance and whether or not we encounter those beliefs. And I think a lot of people's beliefs are things that they've acquired in childhood, and we have a lot of information about that in our surveys. And there's a very, very strong correlation with the kind of household that you're raised in and then the character of the kind of beliefs that you have as an adult.
You touched on this a bit in talking about people who are poor, and there's a lot of uncertainty. But is there, how do demographics fit into this in terms of race and culture and age? And
Sure. So what we generally find is that the more disadvantaged the person is in terms of population characteristics, be it income, be it education, if they're in a marginalized racial group, they tend to have, they're more likely to have magical beliefs. But the interesting thing is when we actually look at magical thinking, the symbolic versus tangible thinking, we don't see a lot of big differences there. And that suggests to us...
Why is that? What do you think?
I don't know. Maybe that's a susceptibility to those kinds of heuristics. That's only one element that's behind magical thinking. I mean, behind people's magical beliefs. There's a lot in terms of emotions that are important there. But I think, some people, like I've spoken to a number of people who are artists, and they score very high in symbolic thinking. And, they'll say, well, of course, I'm an artist. I think creatively. Creativity is about metaphor and association. And these are very well-educated people. So
well, it's also the idea of, and I know that I do this when I look at that, I mean, the blank page scares me. And then all of a sudden, there's something there. It's like, how did that happen?
Yeah.
I mean, clearly, I wrote it, but it's the whole idea that,
it's magic.
It feels magical often,
Yeah.
I'll tell you that. So I think we're going to open up to questions.
Question for you. How do we communicate with people who believe the other side? So if I'm a liberal, what linguistic jujitsu do we use to not call them an idiot, but to say, well, I know you believe this, but how do we get them to meet us at a 45-degree angle to what they believe?
Talk about the weather. Change the subject. That's the easiest strategy. I think it's actually, I've been thinking about this and trying to think that to what extent, if people hold these types of beliefs, because we've all encountered this, where it's just some people, they hold a belief that we don't agree with, and it's just impossible to reason or communicate even over some gap. And the only thing that I can think of in answer to that is if magical beliefs are about responses to apprehension, then it's about making people feel perhaps heard or understood. I mean, this is what I try to, I don't want to sort of patronize and say this, but I do this with my kids. My kids have lots and lots of magical beliefs, and they're completely unreasonable. And the only way to communicate them at some point is to say, okay, come here, come and get on my lap, and I'll just listen to them and kind of say, okay, I understand. And at that point, I notice they kind of soften. Now, I don't know if you could do this with the person who's, believing you.
Put them on your lap.
But I think one of the problems is that we see this big divide, and I would say between kind of pre-Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinkers. And I assume most of you in the audience probably are post-Enlightenment type of thinkers. You come to an event like this. And when I started this research, I was in the same way. We kind of assume that the rest of the world should think the way we do because it works for us. And when people don't share our beliefs, we tend to denigrate them or think they're irrational. And their beliefs actually have a strong utility for them. And in some ways, I think empathy is a big part, and making feel like, okay, I understand where you're coming from. Maybe we disagree, but maybe you could understand where I'm coming from. And I think a little empathy on one side will generate probably empathy on the other.
I'm actually really interested in the topic of leadership and how it intersects with the magical thinking topic. So when I think about what's important to a leader, inspiring and motivating and driving change, so I'm curious to hear from you whether the magical thinker or the more tangible thinker is best suited to leadership.
That's a good question. I hadn't thought of that before. And I think it depends on who they're trying to lead and what they're trying to do. You would hope that the person who is having to make decisions is actually making decisions in a reasoned manner and is attuned to facts and knowledge and systematic understanding. And so you would probably want somebody who is not so quick to respond to a metaphorical lure or in some emotional way. And that might be a great leader of an organization that has to make a lot of practical decisions. And then, I should say we have a lot of magical thinking in our politics, but there's a lot of in our politics where we don't have magical thinking. I think we engage in magical thinking in our political discourse because there's so much of our politics that's uncertain to us. But there's a lot in our politics that we know pretty well. Like, if we think about certain kinds of government programs that there's a strong support for, there's not, there's less, we can talk about sort of the tangible differences of these and probably have good communication. It's really about, I think, those kinds of political issues that engender a lot of uncertainty for people, where people get really amped up. But as a leader, of course, you want somebody, the Enlightenment worked, and democracy is an Enlightenment institution. And we live longer and live better, arguably, today because of embracing scientific principles for understanding how the world operates. And I think, if you look at organizations that are based primarily on magical beliefs, they end up looking like ISIS. Political organizations, I should say.
Building on your point about empathy as a baseline for communication and building on mutual respect, is your sense that people who think magically perceive themselves as stigmatized, that they are looked at as outliers or kind of isolated for that, or are they kind of in their own more of a cocoon? Because it seems that if different types of magical thinkers could acknowledge and respect each other's approach, that it would allow to have a conversation between those who apply magical thinking to things that can be easily disproved versus things that can't.
That's a great question. When we think about magical beliefs, they are, by definition, transgressive, at least transgressive to sort of dominant discourses. The things like conspiracy theories, rejection of science, even a lot of supernatural beliefs oftentimes are really not embraced by, I think, our sort of dominant cultural norms. And so to hold these beliefs is undeniably costly for people. And what we see is that when people who hold these beliefs and these beliefs have utility for them, what they end up doing is sequestering themselves away. And that, I think, reinforces the difficulty of dialogue and discourse across this, because nobody wants to hear a lot of, we don't like sitting in the car and listening to talk radio that sort of, goes opposite of what we want to say. It would just aggravate us. And so, I'd rather go listen to, if I'm conservative, I'll listen to Rush Limbaugh, or liberal, I'll listen to, NPR or something like that. And so there is an emotional, we will have, the more we rely on magical beliefs, we're probably, like with all of our beliefs, more we want to ensconce ourselves in them. And I think that's a big challenge for us as a society, is speaking across those.
Good evening, thank you. I'm interested in two sets of distinctions. One would be, I would tend to think not that the conservatives are a monolith, but among the Tea Party, we're not going to find people who are evolutionists who listen to NPR. They're going to be mostly conservative, religious, actually Christian fundamentalist types. And also, that one distinction, and also the second one, do you have different categories of so-called magical belief? I mean, believing in bizarro conspiracy theories about Obama being born in Kenya is one thing, but traditional Christian orthodoxy, I would think, would belong in a different category, and you might find people who would subscribe to, say, the Westminster Confession of Faith, but also be evolutionists and also be kind of hard-headed rationalists. So those two... Right.
I think that, you bring up a good point, which a lot of what might fall into the category of magical belief when it comes to religion is not necessarily also under this category of fundamentalism that I put forth. And that's why a lot of our research, what we've tried to do is differentiate fundamentalism, which really I think is based on a much more charismatic and intuitive understanding of a relationship to the divine. But within Christianity, of course, there are large numbers of sects and large numbers of different interpretations of God and of the Bible. And we've had huge wars fought over these things. And so it's actually hard to, I don't want to make sort of sweeping generalizations about Christianity per se, but what we are finding is at least clustering around certain sets of beliefs that I think are highly magical, and the idea that, the Bible has hidden codes in it, that biblical prophecy is imminent, or the power of prayer, that we can, heal people. And, it's interesting, there's some other beliefs that I didn't put up that go like the idea of traditional gender roles, for example, is highly correlated with these types of beliefs. And what we're finding is there's this great panoply of different beliefs that are out there, but we keep seeing this constellation, and this was what really brought us to this topic, was that the biggest predictor of whether or not people believed in conspiracy theories is whether or not they believed in end times. And that really got us, well, what does end times belief have to do in the same with conspiracy theory? And then we saw the same thing, like people who believed in end times were much more likely to think that GMOs are bad, for example, are much more likely to avoid getting flu shots. And that's what really, in a sense, it was looking at these patterns that we were seeing in the data that really brought us to this topic.
Have you done some research on other countries? Is the United States very different from other countries, or?
So we haven't done the scale yet. I'm still trying to get the U.S. down. But that's our next topic. And, there is, people have their own stereotypes. Of course, this country is going to be very rational. We think of the Scandinavians, of course, they're not going to be magical in their beliefs. And, we think that other countries will be very magical. But I'm not so sure about that. I will be very curious to see. That's going to be our next step, is to try to do cross-national surveys on this.
Eric, I'm wondering about regions of the country.
Uh-huh.
Are there, the South, West, Northeast, is there a way to pinpoint which area is
we do this we have sort of multivariate models where we try to control for these different factors, and we have looked at region, and by itself, region doesn't oftentimes account for a lot. Yes, you'll find more religious fundamentalists in the South because there are more religious fundamentalists in the South, and then they tend to score higher on certain types of scales. But it's not that region per se seems to have an independent effect.
So, in the United States, about 20% secular people saying 15-20%. Do they have also magic thinking?
Yes.
How many percent of them?
I'm sorry. The question is about 20% of the American population, depending on how you answer the question, would say that they don't believe in God or they don't really have a religious affiliation. Do these people hold magical beliefs? First off, I think there's two questions then. Are they magical thinkers and do they hold magical beliefs? Yes, they're magical thinkers. Magical thinking is something that we all do. And yes, they do have magical beliefs, but they tend to be different kinds of magical beliefs. They're much more likely to, for example, to believe in paranormal phenomena, like the healing power of crystals, or in astrology, or in past lives. And in a lot of ways, these are types of beliefs that serve the function of religion, but for people who have no religion, they embrace it. And the people on the other end, for example, who are on the religious end of the spectrum, they're less comfortable with these types of beliefs.
So I guess we can see some good, or we will leave here either feeling a little optimistic or very pessimistic. I want to talk just briefly about race. It's a very complex issue, and how do you, and maybe this is something that we talked about, it's any third real issue. How do you feel a little bit pessimistic in terms of how we do start to deal with racial issues?
Well, I think in terms of racial politics, the same kinds of processes that we see with magical beliefs, I think, are also animating people's racial beliefs.
Yeah.
In terms of the overutilization of heuristics, stereotypes, making uninformed judgments based on a few pieces of information, having their racial views really informed by their apprehension, and their feelings of discomfort and fear. And once again, if we can find the way we can talk across, say, for example, different kinds of magical beliefs, perhaps the same formula that's useful there would be a way of talking across the racial divide in the country.
Thank you. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for coming.